The Well of Mud. This is the fifth story in this six-story series. It's actually an exact continuation of the last story. This is the final fall. Then the last story, the Babylonians came and they took Jerusalem twice, and now this is the final chapter. Just to talk about how could evil nations do these things to the temple of God. They went in there and they tore the thing down. How did God allow that? I mean, Asa just touched the ark of God and was killed. And here they're tearing the temple down. Well, we find from Ezekiel that God had already left the temple. He wasn't there. It was just an empty shell. It had nothing to do with anything spiritual as far as God was concerned. So, and he even told Solomon, you and your descendants apart from me, I'll have this house torn down. It's a fulfillment of what God told Solomon. Babylon would remain in power about 44 years after this event. Now, after they conquered Jerusalem and tore it down and no longer had to worry about that nation, they went into Egypt and they conquered Egypt. The very thing that Egypt didn't want, Babylon rolled in there and totally conquered the thing. And then 44 years later, they ran over themselves. As far as length of time, compared to the Assyrians, they were not in power very long at all. They were taken over by the Persians. Now you have to understand, the Jews loved the Persians. The Persians treated them well, and the Jews, right up when the Greeks took over and the Romans, the Jews continued to be loyal to Persia. Let me deal briefly about freedom of religion as far as these world powers are concerned. The three that we have right here, the Assyrians had a freedom of religion. They didn't care who you worshiped as long as you sent money to them. They were more of a military might. They had their gods, but they didn't really worry about what the people themselves worshiped. As I mentioned before, people often took their gods because they thought maybe they were the more powerful ones, but also to try to get on the good side of the Assyrians. But in truth matter, they didn't care one way or the other. Now the Babylonians were different. They felt that their God was God, and everybody should worship them. That's why Nebuchadnezzar thought nothing of going in the temple and taking certain things out to take back to the temples of his God. Meanwhile, tearing down the temple meant nothing to him. But when you get to the Persians, now the Persians, they leaned to the side of, you ought to worship your God. You ought to be faithful to him. They had certain influences like Daniel, and Nehemiah, and Ezra, Esther, these great powers that influenced them in a mighty way. They wanted the people to worship their own gods. Well, we have only one more story in this 6-part series. Next week we'll deal with after the fall. And as we continue, I trust you'll come back, as we continue on with the Story Insights on the Story of the Week. We'll see you next week.